hotline just for major CEOs. That's what New York is considering following the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Per CNN, Governor Kathy Hochul's office is convening a safety summit between nervous business owners and law enforcement on Tuesday. The proposed hotline would offer a direct line to law enforcement if threats are perceived. Hochul will meet with 175 corporate representatives, plus Homeland Security and counterterrorism officials.
The unprecedented reaction comes despite no other documented attacks on CEOs, and of course the alleged shooter in the Thompson case, Luigi Mangione, has been arrested. So is Hochul's idea a bridge too far? Independent journalist Ken Klippenstein believes that it is. In a new Substack piece, Klippenstein argues that the meeting is a signal that officials are trying to elevate the killing of Thompson to an act of domestic terrorism. Here to elaborate is Ken Klippenstein himself. Welcome, Ken.
Hey guys, thanks for having me again.
So just to start off with this idea of the hotline itself, I was perplexed myself when I read about that because I thought, well, there already is a hotline for anyone who feels that their life is threatened. You can call 911. But this is a whole different CEO or corporate specific idea. So tell us what you make of it.
Yeah, it's almost like NYPD Plus or the Delta Sky Lounge of law enforcement for these corporate executives to call into. As you point out, the NYPD is not just a well-resourced law enforcement agency, it's the best resourced law enforcement agency in the country with a budget of over several $billion. And so the point to me is not that people don't have a channel for them to call into if they feel threatened. It's why these corporate executives should have their own special one, separate and apart from the rest of the public, especially in the absence of any articulate and specific credible threat to their livelihood, aside from the suspected shooter who, as you mentioned, has been apprehended. I think what's going on here is you're seeing a panic on the part of not just state officials in New York, but across the country. We just saw a mother of three in Florida arrested and charged with terrorism in relation to a threat that she made on a phone call with her health insurance company saying, you guys are next. Delay, deny, depose, the three words that are allegedly written on the bullet casings. Obviously not something you should say, and something for which she apologized. But I think the question here should be, is it necessary to elevate these things to the level of domestic terrorism, which brings with it an entire counterterror and national security apparatus above and beyond ordinary law enforcement resources and the law enforcement system that we have in place? So that's really the thing I think should be debated right now.
Yeah, certainly debated or just squashed, just prevented from having domestic terrorism become more and more a part of the charges of routine criminal matters, or even just what ought to be protected speech being rounded up to that. In this Luigi Mangione case, I haven't seen any evidence or heard anyone so far even say that there were like prior threats, and the inability of Brian Thompson to get a hold of law enforcement would have made some difference. That is not the case, right? He shot and killed him allegedly, presumably, without having given Brian Thompson any prior knowledge that he was after him. Are the CEOs actually the ones demanding this, saying we need some special line to law enforcement, or is this some weird, ingratiating move by Hochul to be better liked by the business community? It's just such a weird thing to even be asking for. I have a hard time. I wonder whose idea it was.
I think it's bidirectional. You are seeing a panic on the part of Wall Street. And if you look at the financial coverage, I don't think that it's isolated to Hochul. But in the case of Hochul and government officials across the country, they see this as an opportunity to justify the massive expenditure in this security apparatus that we have, which, by the way, there's no evidence succeeded at catching this guy. I mean, somebody found him at a McDonald's, just some random guy saw him, thought maybe it was him, called police. That's what closed this case, not the huge amount of technical surveillance in the national security world. They call it ubiquitous technical surveillance because it really is everywhere. And over the course of the first several days since the murder of former CEO of United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, what we saw was a NYPD attempt to piece together with all of these different means, all these different cameras, all this surveillance they have at their disposal, and it utterly failed to catch this guy. It ended up just being an ordinary tipster in Pennsylvania who called in, mentioned before in McDonald's, said, "Oh, I think this is him," and that's how they got him. But the authorities are using this as a case not just to say, "Hey, look at how great all this expensive and by the way, I think alarming the amount of technical surveillance that we have in this society." Is maybe we should expand this to counterterrorism. One of the biggest parts of the meeting that Hochul's having with all these CEOs that you mentioned at the top of the segment is the fact that counterterrorism is going to be the focus of the meeting, sharing counterterror intelligence with other intelligence agencies, not just within NYPD, but across state lines and nationally. So, this is really, I think, viewed as a huge opportunity on the part of the national security state to try to expand its domain and its capabilities.
And talk a little bit more about that, Ken, in relation to what has happened since the killing of Brian Thompson, because it seems to me, in addition to the dangers that defining such acts as terrorism would bring in terms of, an apparatus and a kind of the business of policing expanding, it seems to me there's just on a fundamental free speech or dissenting speech basis, it's really tough to consider this terrorism. I mean, I'm not advocating for people going out and shooting health insurance executives or anybody else, but is that really terrorism? I mean, it would not meet my kind of rule of thumb definition of terrorism. It may have, in the broad sense, a political motive in the sense of a rage at the perceived inequities of the healthcare system and the health insurance system. But defining these kind of criticisms, like the woman in Florida who you mentioned, as criminal, is that dangerous in and of itself, in your view?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we have to separate from this the question of whether the suspected killer engaged in a terrorist act. I think it's pretty clear that there was a political dimension to this, judging from the manifesto, which I published, and in it is articulation of his grievances with the health insurance industry. We have to separate that from the assertion that this is somehow spreading. If you watch the news media, particularly cable news, where they have these former government officials, there has been a full court press to try to cast this as having a quote contagion effect. The idea that it's going to spread and there are going to be all these copycat killers. That was initially the reason that the press didn't release. That was one of the reasons cited for why the press didn't release the manifesto in the first place, is saying that this is going to inspire copycat killers. First of all, that's just media paternalism at its worst, to say we're going to make the security determination here rather than the security officials, and withhold this from you. For some reason, it's okay for the public to have the manifesto. It's that for the news media to have the manifesto, it's too dangerous for the other part of the public, the audience, to be able to see it. But that's based on this presupposition that people are going to see this, and like some sort of trigger word in a Manchurian Candidate type movie that's going to just spur everyone to violence. And as we've seen with the public since the publication of the manifesto, that is not the case. It has not spurred other similar attacks. And so I think everyone needs to take a deep breath here and say, okay, there was one instance of this. Has there been any other serious attempt to do something like that? No, there hasn't. And absent that, I don't understand why we need to have this kind of, I think, panicked response that we're seeing, trying to treat this as though it's some kind of national trend in the absence of any evidence that that's the case.
Well, and it's also not as if suppressing the manifesto was somehow going to prevent idolizing of this. This figure is, I would argue, being idolized to some degree, ironically, by some people, but because he is attractive and has an attractive background, and the media cannot stop people on social media from sharing pictures of him and discussing him. It's just, it's insane to think that, well, if we suppress his manifesto, we will contain a kind of contagion effect. If one is taking place, that's just like not going to happen. It's clear this person is inspiring some degree of public interest for beyond just the crime itself. But like you, I wonder. I mean, there is no definition, right, of what terrorism is. If terrorism is just committing a violent crime for a tangibly political associated reason, then yes, I guess it is terrorism, as is virtually all violent crimes that are not just you attacked your neighbor or something because you didn't like them, or your domestic violence, those wouldn't count. Workplace violence wouldn't count. But anything for any other discernible motive, which we should say is a low category of crime, right? Most violent crime is gang-related violence or domestic violence or workplace violence or something like that, the category of crime that is even plausibly political is very, very low. But it seems to be the one, to your point, that is obsessed over by media more than anything else.
Yeah, and we have laws in place that make it very difficult to charge domestic individuals with terrorism who are not acting on behalf of a foreign agent, because it's understood that the apparatus that's brought to bear on a designated terrorist is very powerful and is anathema to civil liberty. So for that reason, when you look at the State Department designations of terror groups, they're all foreign-based. And to the extent that we charge people operating on the U.S. with it, it's that they have some connection or link or tie to a foreign terrorist organization. So this is very serious stuff, and I don't think people realize the fire that they're playing with when these officials come out and say, as they have, as the deputy chief of the NYPD intelligence, Rebecca Weiner, has said recently in a talk to the Atlantic Council think tank, describing this as terrorism. I don't think people realize how serious that is.
Ken Klippenstein, thanks once again for joining us. Always a good conversation, and more Rising coming up right after this.